Wow, these are some seriously impressive numbers. This is Joe, which is astrophoto.com, and today I'm going to be rebuilding my EQ6R-Pro. So I don't know if you've seen Glenn from Astrobloke's channel latest video on rebuilding his EQ6R-Pro, but it really inspired me to try and do it myself. My guiding numbers have been creeping up between 0.6 to 0.8 total RMS, and that's with a permanent PEC and guiding assist, and really trying really hard to get those numbers as low as possible, and they're still managing to creep up a little bit. And I haven't had much trouble balancing or anything like that, but I figured after watching his video, he made it look pretty simple, and I thought I would do the same. Now, I wasn't really planning on doing a video on this, but I did talk to Glenn, and while we were talking, he said, hey, why not do the video? You're going to be doing it anyway, and that would give viewers another perspective, or maybe they'd see something that they didn't pick up out of his video. Okay, so I brought the mount in the house. It's extremely hot outside. It's too hot in my workshop to work on it. So what I did was just make a little makeshift workshop in my basement. Wish me luck, I'm gonna need it, and let's get started. I've got the dovetail plate off. I took that off before I even left the observatory because I knew that I was gonna have to remove it. And the first thing I'm going to do is take off the declination clutch lever. Now I'm going to remove the nut. I'm going to remove the weight bar. Okay, I'm going to turn this so you can see. Okay, so now I'm going to loosen up the weight bar retaining collar with these 3 grub screws. And now this back collar is supposed to unscrew off of here, but this turns, so you want to hold this up here and then grab this and turn. There we go. So I got a little 2x4 block and my mallet. I'm just going to go ahead and okay, that did pop out relatively easily. We got the bearing here, popped out the back, and the bearing looks pretty clean. I don't see, there is just a number. I don't see any branding on the bearing. Yep, there we go. See the shaft. So I wanted you to see the Teflon washer that you would normally remove. I'm not sure we could see that with the camera, but it is right there. It's still in there, and it's still in really good shape and condition. So for the moment, I'm just going to leave it on there. But I just wanted to make note of it. Because if you're rebuilding one of these, then you might need to replace that so that you get your spacing correct. Now that we have the shaft out, I'm going to go ahead and turn this on its side, and we're going to remove the belts. The belts need to come out before we can take the rest of the DEC axis part apart. So we're going to flip this over. Try and keep this in the... I hope this is coming out, because I'm not doing it again. Yep. Yeah, it was just the 4 outer screws. These inner screws hold, looks like it holds the actual board on. So now with the cover off, I'm going to see if I can get a different video angle for you. So this is what the screws look like inside that I'm loosening for these stepper motors right here. It's these here that we're loosening up for these stepper motors, and these are the belts. So hopefully you can see this belt. We're gonna loosen this up, this pulley, to go ahead and get the belt out. And you have to loosen it from the back. With fingers, pull it out of there. Alright, so got this belt off. Now I'm gonna flip this around. And while I'm at this, I'm gonna remove the RA belt as well. And then just gently pop this belt out. Okay, I've got it flipped back over. I'm going to go ahead and put a screw back in this plate for now, because I don't want to take the plate out and all the electronics and the clips. I don't think it's going to hurt. If I need, I'll need to pop this back off so that I could retighten the belts later, but for now I think I'm just going to put a screw in. And we're going to go ahead and remove this here. There is a bolt here, here, and here, and one on the back side. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those. Yeah, you can see that. Lift this up. Now this should lift right off. Here's our worm gear. Right. And this just lifts right off. There's supposed to be a washer. Here it is, a Teflon washer right here. I'm going to set this to the side. It's in really good condition, so we'll be reusing it. And there's one bearing in here. I'm going to see if I can't get it out with my fingers, but I might need to go get one. It did pop out. And there is a brand on this. It's Rolux. I don't know if that's a popular brand. There's a lot of grease coming off of this. I don't know if it's leaking. I'm sure it was pre-packed. It was just too packed. I don't know. So I'm going to clean all this up. Okay, well now that I got this cleaned up, I'm going to move it off to the side. I think that's good. I'm just going to put my fingers in at opposite ends and just pull straight up. You almost need a bearing puller to make this job easier. Okay, this is proving difficult. Oh. Never mind, you just need to get it at the right angle. Okay, now we're going to start on the worm drive carrier. And find the Allen key. There should be an Allen, should be a hex screw here. Yep, there's 2 of them. Okay, these should be loose. Let's see if I can get this to come off. I don't know if you could see. There we go. This feels very cheap. Unfortunately, I'm a little sad at how cheap that feels. Alright, so I'm going to use some needle nose pliers to get this and turn it. And that was pretty, well, it was pretty easy, but my hands are full of grease. There are 2 slots in there, And you need to be careful because you don't want to mess up the threads for the cap to go back in. But what I'm going to try and do is get the needle nose pliers to sit inside those two grooves and then turn it. There we go. This is, if I can just get this loose enough to push with the screwdriver. So I don't know if you can see in there, but there's the slot, and I got it loosened up with the needle nose pliers. It wasn't super tight, and now I'm just using the screwdriver and I'm just spinning it around. And you just have to take care not to damage the threads. And it's going to take a bit, so I'll probably speed this part up. It's coming out. It's almost here. It's free. Wow. Wow. That took a while. Alright, I'm just going to take this bearing off. Two bearings off, and that will come out. And there is a lot of grease on one end. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and clean all this up. Got the deck done. It's all apart, and I've cleaned it all up. And now we're going to go ahead and work on the RA. We're going to take the puller cap off. Just loosening this up and taking that off. Now there's some holes with some grub screws on either side of the puller scope finder. And loosen, not tighten. And that should release this. Okay, now that that's off, we're supposed to be able to unscrew the puller scope. Oh, there we go, I think I got it. These things aren't very tight, it's just that my hands are, here's the puller scope, my hands still have grease on them. So I'm going to set that aside somewhere where it won't get damaged. Not that I ever use it, but still. We should be able to see the RA shaft. And this is also supposed to unscrew, but I might need to get a filter wrench or put a towel around this and get some pliers, channel locks to unscrew it. You got 3 holes here, and you get a set screw. The thing we want to do is take off the right ascension lever. Okay, so for the RA nut, you're going to want to get something like this. This is just an oil filter wrench. It's very small for very small oil filters. And I want to attach it there. And now you're going to have to hold the RA from moving because we've released the RA nut clutch. So we're going to get this tight, hold this down, and turn. There we go. I think I broke it loose. So you'll want to lift the assembly and pull out the rest of your RA axis shaft. I'm going to set that down, and we're going to pull out the bearing. And again, this has no markings on it as to what brand it is. And we're going to set that over here. We're going to work with our shaft. Okay, so our next step is to loosen up the RA set screws. And we could remove the RA cover with these head bolts right here. The whole assembly should come out. The plate is loose. Looks like we got one. We got one little clip, wire clip to remove down here. If you can see that. For the encoders, most likely. That's the RA scale. Just remove it. And here's our worm gear. There we go. There's very little tolerance in the shaft and the inner diameter of the pulley. I mean the bearing. So you need to make sure that it's equal amount of pressure going up with your finger. So here we have that Teflon washer. We do need to be careful with it because we're going to reuse it. Now we can bring up the rest of the shaft. Again, equal pressure all around. And get to the collar. Okay, and then we're going to, again, I put fingers in opposite way and then just pull straight up. And if you're lucky, get it out, and if not, it gets stuck and you have to tap it back in. I am very, very gently tapping. And then try again. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the next thing we do is we're going to get the RA worm drive, and the worm gear for the RA has an encoder circuitry. So before we removed it from the shaft, there was a little clip, and that goes right here, and I released that clip. Let's get some needle nose pliers, and remove the cap. Very careful, and turning the screw turns the entire shaft. I'm going to hold the shaft with one hand, move the screw with the other to get the encoder off. I hope that's showing up on the camera. And I'm going to let that. Alright, now I'm going to loosen up these grub screws. That is corroded on there. I don't know if you could see the corrosion. So I'm going to have to I think I might take some emery cloth and see if I can't clean that up. Unscrew that all the way out again. So this is going to be just like the DEC Axis, so I'm not going to make you sit through that, but I will be right back. Okay, so I've got it up to the top. It takes a while to get there. So now we're going to, should be able to just push this on through. There we go. And it might be easier if I can get this bearing off. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to take this one off this side if I can get it past the corrosion. So I got some emery cloth here. I'm going to just use a little bit of this to see if I can clean up this corrosion. Now we're ready to put our RA worm gear assembly back together. Everything's been cleaned. I'm going to go ahead and slide this back in, and I'm going to put one of my new bearings. There we go. And then we'll put another new bearing. I'm going to lube this one up just slightly along the outside. Very little, just to help it go in. If you could see that, but now it is. It's seated the way it's supposed to be. Okay, next we're gonna put the end gear back on, just like this, and we'll tighten up our grub screws, or set screws. Next thing we need to do, and this is going to take a minute, is to put this back in. I'm going to put just a tiny bit of lube on the threads to see if I can get it to go a little easier and to protect those threads from later. Okay, we're back, and I just went ahead and tightened this down with the needle nose pliers. I got each one in the groove and just slowly turned. You do not want to make this tight. As you can see, it's spinning very nice right now, and there's little to no play in the back and forth of the shaft. Okay, so before I grease this up, I'm going to go ahead and put the encoder back on. And the sensor goes on right here. Give those a little snug. And we'll put our cap back on. And now we're going to add our super lube to the worm gear. And we're going to grab our brass RA worm gear, and we're going to add new bearings to it. These are SKF 6008 bearings. I actually say SKF and 6008 on them. They're pre-greased, so we do not need to open these up, but I am going to just put a dab around the outside to help it go in. Again, this is like taking them out. You want them to go in at the same time. It doesn't hurt to tap them with the mallet, but you need to be very gentle. This isn't, you're not pounding it or prying it. You're just giving little taps. And make sure it's seated inside, and it is. And then we'll do the other end. Same thing, I'm just going to get a little bit of grease, tiny bit, and just rub a little bit along the outside of these bearings. And again, just try and slide them in, and a little tap. So now we're going to get our shaft. Hopefully you can see that on the camera. And we're going to find our Teflon washer that we had taken off, and we're going to go ahead and slide that back down. Now we'll slide the whole brass worm assembly and the bearings back on the shaft. Okay, now that we got the bearings back on, we're going to add on our Teflon washer, and I'm going to go ahead and set that back on. I just need to plug this in. I don't think the camera's going to pick this up, but it's just a little plug, and it can only go on one way. There, and we're set in there. Now we're ready to put the next bearing on. This bearing actually goes in here. I'm going to slide it on here first because of the way I'm putting this on, like that. But before I put this on, I need to add this plate back. And lightly tap it with the mallet. There we go. Okay, now that the shaft is back in the RA, we're going to put our RA nut back on. And it doesn't have to be quite as tight as it was to take off, but tight enough to seat all the bearings in. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a tighten again with this oil filter wrench that I used to take it off with. Next thing to do is to retighten all of the grub screws. Alright, then we're going to put this plate back on. Let's tighten those up. And then we can thread this back in. That's it. Let me go ahead and put the cap back on. Okay, so now we're ready to start rebuilding the deck axis. The first thing we're going to do is rebuild the worm gear enclosure. I'm just going to get a couple of these bearings out and ready. And we'll put this in like this. And we'll put one of these bearings on. We'll go ahead and slide that in. And then we'll add our next bearing. Slide that in. Now we'll put this gear back on, the end gear. Now for the fun part, my favorite, screwing this all the way in. Alright, so we got this back in, and now I'm just gonna give it a little bit of a tighten with the needle nose pliers, and now that's running pretty smooth again. So now we're gonna lube up our worm gear. There's quite a bit on there. It doesn't look like there is on the camera because this stuff's really clear, which is a good thing, I think. But I don't think it shows up very good on the camera. So I'm not sure if it's looking like I'm barely putting any on, but there's quite a bit. As a matter of fact, I'm rubbing it away from all the places that it got after. Before I forget and continue on with this, I need to put the RA clutch back together again. Our next step is to get some bearings inside of the roller bearing. I should say the main roller bearing for the deck axis. And we're going to get our next bearing in right here and our last 6008 bearing. No tapping or anything on that one. We need to make sure that we have our Teflon washer. Look at this. Oh, you're kidding me. Why did you pop out like that easy when I had to use the mallet to get you in? Okay, hopefully it'll stay in this time. We gotta get our Teflon washer and set it down here. And then we're gonna put the main roller bearing on the deck shaft. Yeah, that works. Let's get our other head bolts in. Okay, before we put our deck shaft back in, we need to get our belts back the way they were. There we go. Okay, I've tightened the belts, and now I'm going to put the board back on. Hopefully you can see these belts. I'm going to just see how much they move now that I've tightened them up. So, as you can see, they're not super tight. They've got a little bit of play. Alright, so our next step is going to be replacing the shaft. This is for the deck axis. And the only thing that I have to do is put this button back in place here. And I'm just going to set it in this hole. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to flip this around, see if we can get an angle where we can see what we're working on over here. It's time to put the roller bearing in for the deck axis. We want to make sure that this is in the center. There is some play, and I've got a brand new bearing here. It's a Timken bearing. Next, we're going to replace the weight bar collar. There we go. The weight bar goes on this side, and it goes this end first with the screw cap going in first. Now we'll add the covers back on. Okay, so I've got everything back on. I've had it on for a few days. I've been adjusting and fine-tuning everything to get the guiding right, and I'll show you that in a minute. But what I wanted to show you first was how to how I went about adjusting everything after I was done with the rebuild. Okay, so here we're looking at the deck axis, and in order to adjust this after you're done with your rebuild, what you would do is you would loosen up these head bolts here. And you could see that earlier in my video. They're the same head bolts that allowed the deck axis to come apart. And once they're loosened, I'm going to loosen up the top Allen key up here, and then tighten this one. And we're talking very small, maybe 1/16 of a turns. And what you want to do is get just a little bit of wobble here in your deck axis. And from there, you would slowly loosen the back one where your worm gear is here, and then tighten this one. And what's happening is that as you tighten this one up here, you're moving this worm gear, this whole worm carrier, the deck worm carrier, is sliding up as you tighten this. So it's the opposite of what you think. So you tighten this worm carrier moves up, and it brings the worm gear closer to the other gear that's inside here. And when they mesh up just right, then you've got it tuned exactly where you want it. The trick is to not get it too tight that it binds. And this took me about 3 nights of kind of just inching it forward. And I mean just inching it forward. You would just barely loosen this. I mean just a nudge. And then you would tighten that. Then what you have to do is tighten these back down again, very gently. And then test your guiding to see how your guiding is, how the RA is going. And I would test it for a while, and then I would do a calibration, make sure everything was okay, and then I move on to the RA axis. Now, the deck axis is quite a bit easier to do because in the calibration assistant in PhD2, you've got the ability to show your backlash. And what I found is that when this was too far out, it would show backlash. And when it was too far in and it would start to bind, just barely, it would actually read as backlash in PhD2. I know that doesn't sound correct, but that's what was happening. And by backing this off a little bit, I would see that the backlash would dissipate. And if I went too far out, then I saw that it would go back up again. So there's just a fine line between where this whole worm carrier needs to be. So here's my numbers from the other night while taking an image of the Eagle Nebula. And as you could see, I'm right around 0.7, between 0.7 and 0.8. I wanted to show you me testing everything out and making adjustments as I went on the PhD guiding screen. Here's the graph, and if you notice, you'll see the RA spike. And the RA spikes because there's some binding that's taking place. And I had it to where I didn't think there was any binding. However, there was, and normally you could hear it bind, but it was very, very slight, and I wasn't able to hear anything. But that's what I attribute those spikes to. And as I went through and I backed off a little bit on the RA worm carriage, it seemed to clear up. So here you'll see the third night that I was out, and I had finally gotten everything dialed in. And I've since left it alone. I was getting numbers as low as 0.38 in my total RMS, and as high as 0.5 when clouds had rolled through. And here you'll start to see the numbers jump a little bit because the clouds are starting to roll through, and it's going from 0.41, and I think it goes all the way up to 0.48 and then starts to go back down again at the end of this graph. But I also wanted to point out that my PEC is inactive at the moment. I'm actually trying to capture it right now on the screen in this video that I'm showing to you. Overall, I'm extremely pleased with the way this has worked out. And I'm really loving these numbers as long as they stay the way they are. It was quite a chore to get this tuned after the rebuild. I don't want to make it sound like it was easy. I was out for a few hours each night for 3 nights in order to get all my settings dialed in the way that you see here on the screen. And my RA is actually still a little bit higher than my deck is at the moment too. And I'm hoping that the PEC will straighten that out. If not, I'll go back in on the RA axis and tweak that just a little bit more to try and get those numbers a little closer. So overall, it was a pretty good experience for me. It really taught me more about the mount and mounts in general, equatorial mounts in general. And I want to say that if you've got an EQ6R, and I think if your guiding numbers aren't where you want them, it's a very viable solution. Other than tweaking in the settings at the end, it didn't really take me that long to do. The actual rebuild was relatively quick. I hope that you found this video useful. If you did, please smash that like button, and we'll see you in the next video.